Hello, I'm Louise Whittaker from the Yorkshire region of the Battlefields Trust, a UK charity dedicated to preserving, interpreting and promoting British battlefields. Visit our website at www.battlefieldstrust.com. As it's approaching the anniversary of the Battle of Marston Moor, fought on the 2nd of July 1644, I've got permission to walk a little way up the hill for a view over the battlefield and to say something about what happened here. I'm facing north, looking over Marston Moor. The city of York is northeast from here, and Tadcaster is south. The villages of Tockwith and Long Marston are a couple of miles away, to west and east respectively. Away to my left, nearer Tockwith, the area was known as Bilton Bream, and at the time of the battle had an enclosed rabbit warren on part of it. If you look north, a hedge line at the end of the field across the road marks the boundary in 1644 between the cultivated land on this side and the moorland, and a ditch line stretched across the battlefield. In the distance can be seen Wilstrop Wood, and to the right of the battle monument and information board below is Moor Lane. Both of these existed at the time of the battle. On the outskirts of Long Marston, Atterwith Lane, now a road, tracks northeast. The trees behind me are known as Cromwell's Plump. They weren't here in 1644, but behind them, over the ridge, lay the Allied baggage train. The origin of this battle lay in the siege of York by an Allied army of Scottish Covenanter and Parliamentarian forces, the Scots having invaded England in support of Parliament in early 1644. Prince Rupert had received a letter from his uncle Charles I, which he believed instructed him not only to relieve the city, but also to give battle to the enemy. Believing that the prince would approach the city from the west, the Allied forces moved away from York to not far from Marston Moor to oppose him, only for the prince to approach the city from the north instead. And on July the 1st, the Royalists entered York without a shot being fired. The Allied generals then decided to pull their army away to Tadcaster to consider their next move, with the foot and baggage train being protected by the cavalry in the rear. And it was this cavalry who saw Royalist cavalry coming onto the moor and hastily summoned the rest of their army, some of whom had nearly reached Tadcaster 6 miles away, to return. The Allied cavalry moved on to the ridge, seeing its obvious advantage. There was some concern that Rupert might launch an attack on them before the rest of their army returned, and the prince did see the advantage of Bilton Bream and planted some cannon on the area. But after an exchange of fire and several casualties, the Royalists were forced back onto the moor, and the Parliamentarian cavalry then hopped to it around the rabbit warren to clear any obstacles that might impede their cavalry charge. Rupert had fewer men than the Allies thought, and was himself waiting for the Earl of Newcastle's forces to arrive. As things turned out, the Allied armies had all returned and formed up before Newcastle's army reached the moor at about 4 p.m. in the afternoon. On the 2nd of July, this was the middle of the Allied lines, an army under the overall command of the Scot Alexander Leslie, Earl of Leven. Scottish forces, together with the Parliamentarian armies of the Eastern Association under the command of the Earl of Manchester, and Lord Fairfax's army. The infantry of the three armies was in the centre here, with their cavalry on the wings. Eastern Association horse under Oliver Cromwell, supported by David Leslie's Scottish cavalry, and also a number of dragoons, at Bilton Bream. And Sir Thomas Fairfax on the right of the ridge, spreading to Atterwith Lane. Facing them, at the front of the moorland, were in the west Royalist cavalry commanded by Lord Byron, together with musketeers to offer some protection against an enemy advance, Royalist infantry in the centre, and another body of cavalry and musketeers under Lord George Goring facing Fairfax. Estimated numbers for the two armies are 28,000 1,000 for the Allied side as against 18,000 Royalists. The arable land here was in crop up to the ditch. The nature of this ditch varied across the battlefield, from a relatively small obstacle in the west to a large bank with a hedge and ditch in the east. After some exchange of cannon fire there was a silence, broken only by the Allied forces singing psalms. By around 7 p.m. the Royalist commanders decided that with the fading light of a showery day they would not attack before the morning, and stood down most of their troops, both Rupert and Newcastle retiring from the scene. From up here it's very likely that the Allies had a decent view of campfires being lit, and the Earl of Leven decided to take advantage of this. At about 7:30 a sudden thunderstorm marked the Allied advance in a running march down this hill, taking the Royalists completely by surprise. On the left, Cromwell's cavalry, supported by Leslie, swept down Bilton Bream, crossed the ditch with little trouble, and smashed into the Royalist right wing. The shock and impetus of this downhill charge quickly routed the Royalist right with relatively little opposition, and they fled along by Wilstrop Wood. Byron, who had not retired from his position with the cavalry, was nevertheless soon overwhelmed. Prince Rupert, trying to stem the tide with his lifeguard, ended up being swept along in the panic, and after this point he played no further part in the battle. Parliamentary propaganda has him hiding in a bean field. Sadly for the prince, his beloved dog, Boy, was killed sometime during the rout. On the right wing, Thomas Fairfax's cavalry found more obstacles to their charge. Fairfax himself, with around 80 men, managed to break through and rout the Royalists opposing them, pursuing them towards York, suggesting they found an easier way over the ditch. But the remaining Allied host struggled in the difficult terrain, taking a number of casualties from Royalist musketeers, and were then charged and routed by Goring, who swept them up the hill and beyond the ridge, reaching and attacking the Allied baggage train, which the Royalists then stopped to plunder. Fairfax himself seemed to have lost control of his men, and returned to the battlefield alone, taking the field sign from his hat to pass unrecognised through the Royalist army to his own side. I've now come down Moor Lane, Cromwell's plump on the horizon in front of me, to what was the ditch line that separated the crops from the moor, the Royalist front line. In the centre of the battle the infantry lines clashed. The Eastern Association foot had pushed back their Royalist counterparts, who, of course, had lost the support of their cavalry here. But in the centre and the Royalist left wing, the Allies had either halted or were falling back. 2 brigades of Royalist horse charged and dispersed a number of the foot soldiers, who fled. However, Lord Crawford Lindsay's brigade of Scots stood firm, beating the Royalist cavalry attacks off until they broke them, the extra numbers in the Allied army now telling. With no Royalist horse now left on the field to protect them, the Royalist infantry found themselves squeezed by an attack on all sides. Many of them fled, but Newcastle's regiment of Whitecoats remained, in a dogged stand that's said to have held the Allied attack at bay for an hour. They refused all quarter, until there was only around 30 men out of 3,000 left alive. One trooper said that he spared 2 or 3 of these men against their wills. Cromwell and Leslie's cavalry, who had successfully fought their way across the battlefield, ended up where Goring had been at the start of the battle. As Goring's men returned back over the ridge from pillaging the Allied baggage, thinking the battle was won, they had a nasty shock and had to form up in the same difficult position Thomas Fairfax had found himself in at the start of the battle. A single charge by the Allied cavalry routed them. The battle had lasted around 2 hours and left approximately 4,000 Royalist and 300 Allied soldiers dead on the field. The Royalist commanders returned to York on the evening of the battle. On the 4th of July, Prince Rupert left the city with his remaining horse, while Newcastle made his way to Scarborough and into exile. It was only a matter of time now before York was forced to surrender, which it did on the 16th of July. The battle here proved a heavy blow for the Royalist cause. Prince Rupert's reputation for invincibility had gone, and, with the exception of a few garrisons, the north of England was now lost to the king.